Enmei juku kanangyo kanzeyo namu butsuyo butsu inyo butsu en buposo enjo rakugajo chonen kanzeyon bonen kanzeyon nennen jushinki nennen furishin kanzeyon namu butsuyo butsu inyo butsu en buposo enjo rakugajo chonen kanzeyon bonen kanzeyon nennen jushinki nennen furishin kanzeyon namu butsuyo butsu inyo butsu en buposo enjo rakugajo chonen kanzeyon bonen kanzeyon nennen jushinki nennen furishin absorbing world sounds awakens the Buddha right here. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. The pure heart always rejoices in the light. Recall this in the dark. Recall this moment after moment. The true heart arises time after time. There is nothing. This absorbing world sounds awakens a Buddha right here. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. Thus the pure heart always rejoices in the light. Recall this in the dark. Recall this moment after moment. The true heart arises time after time. There is nothing but this absorbing world sounds awakens a Buddha right here. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. The pure heart always rejoices in the light. Recall this in the dark. Recall this moment after moment. The true heart arises time after time. There is nothing but this. Infinite realms of light and dark convey the Buddha mind. All that is and we ourselves come forth in perfect harmony. We offer this sincere and devoted practice for the many beings of the 6 worlds, and dedicated in grateful thanks to the strength and sound practice of the Great Heartland Sangha and its teachers. May our virtuous actions be clear from all interferences, and may our vows be fully realized. We especially dedicate these merits to Anne Coleman, those whose names we hold in the silence of our hearts, as well as those names we now voice aloud. May we live in perfect peace with Buddha Dharma, and may we realize the Buddha way together. All Buddhas throughout space and time. Please prepare for Zazen. We will now recite the Sangha Covenant. We, the Daishin Kokuju Sangha, with respect for the worth and dignity of each person, with wonder at the wisdom and compassion we seek to cultivate by practice, and with deep gratitude for the teachers of this lineage and our connection to one another, covenant to support each other by upholding the precepts of doing no harm, practicing good, and actualizing good for others. Please have a seat facing the front for this evening's talk. In a moment, we'll recite the Gatha on opening the sutra. Gatha on opening the sutra. The Dharma incomparably profound and infinitely subtle is rarely encountered even in millions of ages. Now we see it, hear it, receive and maintain it. May we completely realize the Tathagata's true meaning. So good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Many of you know the teachers are out of town. They're in upstate New York for the American Zen Teachers Association annual conference. If you can imagine a room full of Zen teachers. I know I'm very grateful to be here this evening. That sounds very intimidating. I guess back to our old friend Shantideva. It's been a while. And let's jump right in. Verse 29. For those who are deprived of happiness and afflicted with many sorrows, hello, right? Bodhicitta bestows upon them boundless joy, eradicates all their suffering. Bodhicitta bestows upon them boundless joy, eradicates all their suffering. So, what is this bestowing? This verse leads into a number of verses on the great paramita of generosity. And it's everywhere in the sutras. When the Buddha was on the road, when he was like talking to folks not in the Sangha, he would always lead with generosity. And of course, it's the first on the list of the paramitas we recite during the daily liturgy: generosity, moral discipline, patience, all of these great virtues, and yet generosity.
is listed first. Not that they're in a gradated sequence, but generosity is always first on the list. So, and what is this bodhicitta bestowing? Why is generosity so basic to bodhicitta, and of course so basic to our practice? And I think the reason all of this came up for me was last night, the Jukai initiates had their class, and they encountered the precept of not sparing the Dharma assets, which is like, when you hear it, it's kind of obscure, but when you encounter, it's like one of the most beautiful of the precepts. And the way we express that during Jukai here is in the genuine, all-pervading Dharma, not being stingy about a single thing is called the precept of not sparing the Dharma assets. One phrase, one verse. That is the 10,000 things and 100 grasses. It is everything in reality, including delusion. One Dharma, one realization. That is all Buddha's and ancestral teachings. Therefore, from the beginning, there has been no stinginess at all. And when Roshi talks about this, he talks about, well, what does that mean, not being stingy about a single thing? And as he expresses it, it's just encountering everything as it is, giving the cloud to the cloud, the bead of sweat to the sweat, the bug to the bug, the tree to the tree, ourselves to ourselves. In other words, we don't fix these things in our mind and make them solid, make them into projections, make them into what we want them to be. Not that cloud. That cloud isn't quite right to be a cloud. You know, I heard someone say the other day, after the Pope did something wonderful, they said, he's not Catholic. I'm like, he's actually the Pope, you know? How hard can you resist reality? And of course, every expression of reality is expressing Buddha nature, including ourselves. And with that in mind, literally, how do we encounter reality? How do we live this life? How do we let everything just be itself? And of course, everything is in this great flow of reality. If we fix, of course, we are like beavers in the dam, putting up a dam against reality, which of course is a hopeless task and is the recipe for suffering. This is suffering, resisting this flow. But of course, before we can encounter reality as itself, we have to encounter ourselves. We have to give ourselves to ourselves. We have to get out of our way, get out of this shell of ego. I don't know if any of you know Tara Brach. She's a teacher in the Theravadan tradition, and she talks about the space suit of ego, that we go through this world wearing this spacesuit, even though the atmosphere is perfectly breathable and the air is not going to damage our skin. Why do we do that? Why do we put up that defense when we don't need to? And I know when I feel things solidifying, I always ask myself the question, what would my life be like if I didn't do that? What would my life be like if I actually encountered myself in this flow of reality without resisting it? And I think one important thing we have to remember is, particularly in our society where we're very judgmental, self-judgmental and critical, is that we are each a unique expression of Buddha nature that has never been experienced and will never be experienced again in space and time, which can be interpreted, I guess, as being very egotistical, but actually it's not. It's exactly what the Buddha said on the night of his enlightenment: I alone stand between heaven and earth. Exactly the same as saying there is no I. Or as you hear it in other circles, there is no God. God is everything. Same thing. So why is bodhicitta, why is generosity, this open heart, critical to bodhicitta, the awakened heart mind? Why is it critical to enlightenment itself? And a thing you hear a lot in the writings on bodhicitta is that it grinds away our self-absorption. And like, why are we so self-absorbed? Why do we do that? Why do we contract rather than expand? Because it seems to be like a baseline, that when we're in difficulties, we do tend to contract. We do put up the mask. Why do we do that? And of course, we have to answer that question first. I shouldn't say first. We're doing the whole thing together. But really, if we don't get to know our own mind, it's going to be really difficult to encounter the mind of bodhicitta. We really have to know ourselves. We have to know what our issues are. We have to get to know ourselves intimately. And, I've encountered many spiritual traditions over the years. And I have to say that, there's a lot of spiritual bypassing going on, where you just neatly avoid that getting to know myself thing, right? I'm really into the external expression of this spiritual path. My experience has been with Zen, you get called on that. It's a lot harder to do it, which is why the few and the hardy come to the Zendo. But there is that tendency to enclose ourselves in that comfortable circle. I know that temptation. I'm very attracted to that temptation. And for me, it helps to see it rather as pushing against reality. It's a withholding. It's a withholding of myself. Robert Frost says, something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living. It was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, which is really heartbreaking, that verse. So the greatest gift we can give ourselves is ourselves. And yet, even though we know this is the cause of our suffering, we direct our energies to maintaining that mask, to not being vulnerable, to staying comfortable. So how do we receive the self? How do we work on this? So in our own tradition, in Zen, there's a lot of, I was going to say scripture, that's never the right word. There's a lot of sutras and writings on this mind of generosity. Dogen calls it the magnanimous mind. It's spacious, it contains everything, it's present, it's attentive. It's the not knowing mind that we hear in Suzuki Roshi's writing. It's releasing ourselves from any fixed view that we try to cling to. Magnanimous mind will just create a space that's big enough to let go of that, if of course we do the work. And Dogen, I love Dogen. He gives these beautiful poetic expressions, which can be, his poetry is really helpful. It's truth, it's authenticity. And sometimes I need a little more direction. I am not one who hates the endless lists of the old tradition. They're actually really useful to me. So according to the teachings, there's 3 kinds of generosity. And the first is the giving of material things, which gets a bad rap. People say, oh, that's easy. And, I remember the first time I went to Chicago, and I was with a guide in the Field Museum, and he was saying how Marshall Field wouldn't sign the check for the building until he was assured his name would always be on it. So a little withholding maybe in that, gift of that beautiful building that's still giving generations later. But honestly, we need only look around the Zendo here to see the gift of giving with an open heart, with no strings, no conditions, no name over the doorway. And this gift that gives us this beautiful container for our practice and gives this to everybody who crosses our threshold for generations to come. This is boundless giving with an open heart. And the second form of generosity is the gift of fearlessness. And there's loads of references in the old suttas to releasing prisoners, releasing prisoners from their delusions, I guess, if we're looking through the analogy. And there are folks here in the Sangha who do this for a living, right? Who perform this generosity on a regular basis. And really, you only have to look around our Sangha to see this continuous giving of really encountering people, which is not always easy. And there's a quote which I found really, really useful for me. It's not from a Buddhist teacher. It's Marianne Williamson, who is, you probably know her, you might know this quote, a progressive Christian thinker. And I'm just going to read it because I don't think there's any better way of expressing this. She says, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. You are an expression of Buddha nature. Your playing small does nothing to serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are meant to shine as children do. That is the truth. We are born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us, our Buddha nature, this expression of reality. It is not just in some of us, it is in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. Rinzin frequently says something along those lines. He says, when leadership just seems so daunting, he said, leadership is not being the best. Leadership is empowering everyone else to be better. So there's this giving of ourselves, and there's also this innate trust that we are perfect and complete, that our Buddha nature is expressing. And, in the midst of, yes, we all need a lot of work, there is this perfection. The story of the Buddha's enlightenment speaks to that directly. Mara, who, is basically constriction and ego and withholding, goes to tempt the Buddha, open, awareness, expansiveness. And he starts with anger. He brings forth the armies, and of course the Buddha sits there and does his mojo, and all the spears and arrows fall as flowers. And then he brings forth the sensual delights, his daughters who dance for the Buddha, and the Buddha just remains equanimous on his seat. And then he brings forth the big gun of, who do you think you are to do this? He says, who witnesses your right to the seat of enlightenment? And the Buddha, of course, simply touches the earth, touches his own direct experience. He said, I call the earth as my witness. And that is what we do in our practice. We touch the earth, basically. We come into our bodies, we touch our own direct experience. As wonderful as Dogen and all the writings and the sutras are, you're not going to find enlightenment there. Your enlightenment is in this body, in your own direct experience. And in trusting that, which I know is a tall order, but that is our way. And then the third kind of generosity is the gift of the Dharma. basically overcoming ignorance, seeing reality as it really is. And of course, if we want to give the gift of the Dharma to others, we have to actualize it in our own minds, in our own heart mind. And bodhicitta is what enables you to do this opening of the heart mind, this boundless generosity, giving yourself to yourself. And really, our own experience is all that we do have to share. This direct experience that we have to trust and we have to express. And sometimes it's the expression of it that is the most difficult. So how does a bodhisattva engage this vast generosity? Pema Chodron says you keep it real. You walk through life with this open heart in your relationship with people, with your environment, with this planet, with everything you encounter. She also talks about doing this work imaginatively. What is better than at the end of a hot, sweaty summer day to have a nice, cool shower and give that experience away to people who've never had running water, who never will have running water. The ways in which we can be generous are boundless. And to go back to giving of ourselves, of our own experience, I thought, I should end with someone very inspirational and inspiring, Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King, these people who totally gave of themselves. But I'm never going to win the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm never going to lead a civil rights movement. And honestly, over the years, some of my greatest teachers have been the most flawed people that I know. But they're people who are willing to take the chance, willing to be vulnerable and to give of themselves. And I was in Ireland recently and picked up a book by Nuala O'Foylan. I don't know if any of you know her. She's a writer, was a writer, I should say. And she wrote a memoir back in the late 90s called Are You Somebody, which is like a great Zen title, right? And it was like a brutally honest, unsentimental documentation of her experience of being a child and a woman in Ireland in the 40s and 50s. And it was, I can't express to you how revolutionary this was in Ireland in the late 90s. Although the way America is going, maybe you're going to have an inkling of how revolutionary it was. And she documented her life of living in a loveless, impoverished home, even though everything seemed perfectly beautiful. She lived in Clontarf, which is like a very upscale suburb of northern Dublin. Her father was well known. He wrote a social column for, I think it was the Irish Independent. He was like always dressed the part, drove around town, everyone knew him, was at all the society parties. Her mother was an intellectual, really well-read, totally attached to her father, who was basically absent. She used to say of her father that he treated the family as if they were people he just met at a cocktail party. Can you imagine your father treating you like that? And her mother, while devoted to her husband, never wanted children, and she had 9 children. Of course, these were the days, yes, well before contraception was available, and it was illegal in Ireland for many years after it was actually generally available elsewhere. You had to do illegal runs up to Northern Ireland and smuggle it back. And a lot of people did that, and a lot of people got charged for doing it. And of course, she was an alcoholic, and this life of impoverishment, of taking care of these kids, just exacerbated that. And Nuala was the second oldest, so a lot of the child rearing actually fell on her shoulders. And she documented this suffering that nobody ever talked about. All of this was always behind lace curtains and closed doors. You know, I always say, how could the Catholic Church have done what it did in Ireland and nobody knew about it? This was going on for decades and decades, and this is why, because nobody ever talked about those things. There was so much shame attached to it. You know, Brené Brown says, where shame thrives is in secrecy. And she was willing to come out and give voice to this, where really no one else had. She said, like in the schools, you got hit in school, and then you came home and you got hit at home for being hit at school. Basically, it was an experience in neglect and being unloved. In a society which, you know, said we cherish our children above all else, we're producing souls for God. So she wrote this book, and she went on this chat show in Ireland. It was called The Late Late Show. Everybody watched The Late Late Show. It was like at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, I think. And of course there was only Irish television. There was no cable. You were like trapped in in your choices for television. But regardless, everybody watched The Late Late, and it's what everybody talked about for the next week. You know, who was on it, what they said. So she went on The Late Late with this book, which basically bared her soul and bared the plight of women in Ireland during those decades. Women had absolutely no power, and children were basically overlooked, neglected. So she went on after she had plucked up the courage to write this book, and the interviewer, of course, was a young man, because media was still dominated by men. And there was a very small section in that book where she talked about escaping Ireland in her early 20s. She went to work for the BBC as a researcher in London, and she documented like sexual encounters she had. So the one question this guy could come up with was basically, well, Nuala, you slept around a lot. In the midst of all of this horror she had documented. And she said the audience in the studio was primarily women. And she said she could feel the audience turn against him. She could feel those women empowering her to talk. And she did talk. And it was like a brutally honest interview about the reality of being a woman in those days. And after that interview, she got all these letters from other women talking about domestic subjugation, alcoholism, abuse, suicide, depression. All of these women, and many of them saying to her, thank you for finally giving me a voice where I can actually say these things and not be, you know, poo-pooed or looked on as someone who should be shameful about this. I remember one of the letters, she wrote a follow-up book in which she included a lot of these letters, and one of them was from a woman who was raised 2 doors down from her. And she said, you know, I used to look at your house and think that's the perfect family. They have everything. And she said, meanwhile, we were going hungry. And she said, my father was so cruel to his children that in modern days he would have been imprisoned for what he did to us. And all of this behind the lace curtains of these beautiful houses. A number of years later, maybe about a decade later, she got a terminal diagnosis of cancer. And it was a very rapid cancer. She was dying and dying fast. And she agreed to do an interview on Irish radio with a friend of hers, Marion Finucane, who was this amazing interviewer. She's like, I don't know if you remember Barbara Walters, like she could get anyone to admit to anything just by talking to them. Marion Finucane was like that. And they had a bond. Marion Finucane had lost her daughter at age 8, and Nuala had been a great support to her. So they trusted each other. And they both agreed that this would not be a hallmark interview. This would be basically what her experience of dying was. And Nuala was always brutally honest. And they recorded this interview, and when they heard it, the suits at RTE, the Irish Broadcasting Company, didn't want to air it. It was just so graphic. And eventually, and they held firm, those women held firm, and they said, no, it gets broadcasted in its entirety. And what they did was they set up these phone hotlines. Do we still have hotlines? Do we know what those are? Okay. So basically these phone banks manned by the Irish Cancer Society and the Samaritans, the suicide prevention people, because they knew once people heard this, it was going to bring up a lot. It was really going to speak to people, and it did. It did. She talked about, she was a woman who lived life to the fullest. She lived in the States, she traveled the world, she wrote for the Irish Times, she wrote books, she was on TV. She was like a big personality. And she spoke about how her death had robbed her of any joy in her life. She said it was like death or life had turned its back on her, and it said, and you're not even going to get any treats at the end. You know? Marian Finucane asked her, well, can you give hope to people? And she said, no, I can't. She said, if they believe in God, I wish them well. If they have some hope, that's wonderful for them. But this is my experience of dying. She was not going to sugarcoat this. Another thing she said was, you know, I'm sour and I'm trouble and I'm difficult and I can't believe how my brothers and sisters and my friends are helping me. Right to the end, she could not believe that she was worthy of that love. In one of her books, she wrote, you know, I'm working on self-regard, but I haven't quite got there yet. And I don't think she really ever did. And basically, she said, like, my despair is my own. If you have hope, your hope is your own. But she was not going to tie this up with a neat bow. What she was sharing was actually herself, her own experience. And she did make the comment that, like, that interview she did in the late 90s on the Late Late Show that blew the cover off shame in Ireland, and this interview that she gave at the end of her life that really blew through the last taboo of talking about death, of having to wrap it up in a nice bow and saying, this is how it is. And she was like uncompromising to the end. She was going to speak her own experience, make herself totally vulnerable, and give of herself. And she said at the end of it, she said, this just is my experience for what it's worth. And I have to say, it was worth a lot. That original book, giving a voice to those who are powerless and vulnerable, and this final interview that, you know, it's still played to this day, that people encounter that truth as just being so rare and precious. And I just want to, like, read, when she was psyching herself up to write the original book, she knew, or she thought she knew what the reaction to it would be. It would be like that little smart aleck guy on the Late Late Show. So she said, I imagined the hostile response I'd get in my little Irish world. Who does she think she is? I could hear the reviewers saying, but it turned out not to be like that at all. The world my story went out to turned out to be so much bigger than I'd ever thought. And it turned out to be full of people who knew me, who were sisters and brothers, although we had never met, who were there to welcome me coming out of the shadows, and who wanted to throw off the shadows that obscured their own lives too. My small voice was answered by a rich chorus of voices, my voice, which had once been mute. Of all the places where my story might start, it started itself at a point in my life where I could not speak at all. And she ends the book by saying, what can I do but take my chances? what else can I do but look after my teeth, listen to all the music I can, and keep going? Keep working on my escape tunnels from the past. Keep hoping to break through to the here and now, to be just myself, like the cat, which is so perfectly and unself-consciously a cat, and does not know that it will perish. What can I do when everything is so various and so beyond me, but thank the God I don't believe in for the miracles showered upon me, for this endless bestowing. And really, I have to say, this expression of ourselves is something Dawn always upholds, that how difficult that can be. I remember her forcing me to go to Open Zazen at the end of a retreat, where you give this expression of your experience, and how valuable that is, this unobstructed giving of yourself. So may it all go well for us.
Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I can think of one announcement off the top of my head, because we just got an email about it. Registration for all session for the rest of the year is open, which is an incredible opportunity to sign up for a retreat. If you've never done so, there are probably places on the website to learn how to do that and who to get in contact with to get started. There might be a teaching retreat coming up soon, is what you all expected me to say, but I didn't double say. Because I don't know when the teaching retreat is. Is it like next week?
It's next week.
I did know what it was. Any other announcements for folks?
So the teaching retreat starts Tuesday, runs through Saturday, 9 to 5. Come for as much or as little as you can. Lunch will be provided.
Wow, what a blessing. Please restore this Sunday, everyone. Have a good night.